Tom Waits did not believe in accidents, not in the mystical sense. He was too grounded for mysticism, too interested in the physical world, in the specific weight of things, to trade in anything that floated. What he meant when he said it was something more practical, that the moments which changed you were usually the ones you hadn't prepared for, the ones that arrived sideways, through a door you hadn't intended to open, in a hallway you were only passing through on your way to somewhere else. He had built an entire career around that idea, around the beauty of the unplanned thing, the wrong note that turned out to be the only note, the found sound, the street noise, the conversation bleeding through a thin wall that ended up in the bridge of a song. He recorded in rooms that other producers wouldn't touch. He used instruments that weren't supposed to be instruments. Brake drums, a chamberlin, a conch shell, whatever the room offered that hadn't been offered before. He had trained himself over 20 years of making records to stay alert to the accidental, to treat the unintended not as an interruption, but as information, as the thing the session was actually trying to tell you if you were willing to listen to it, rather than override it. This was not a philosophy he had arrived at easily. It had come from years of working in the other direction first, of trying to impose control, to shape and manage and produce, and discovering that the most alive moments in any recording were the ones that happened before or after the moment of control. The breath before the note, the room settling after the last chord, the place where the music stopped being performed and started being true. He was very good by 1993 at recognizing that place when he encountered it. So when he stopped in a corridor at a recording studio in Los Angeles in the spring of 1993, it was not nothing. It was exactly the kind of moment he had spent his career paying attention to. The studio was one of those large commercial complexes in Hollywood that housed multiple rooms simultaneously, the kind of building where 3 different albums might be recorded on the same day, separated by walls that were thick but not impermeable. Sound traveled in those buildings in ways that the architects hadn't planned for and the engineers had learned to live with. A bass frequency from one room would appear as a presence in another. A voice at sufficient volume could make itself felt 2 doors down. Not as words, not as music exactly, but as a vibration that carried the shape of something without delivering the content. Waits had booked time in one of the larger rooms for his own session. The exact work has been described differently by different people who were present that day, and the details shift depending on the account. But the corridor is consistent across all of them. He was leaving. He had been in the building for most of the day and the session had gone where it needed to go. And now he was done, moving through the corridor toward the exit with the particular purposefulness of a man who has finished something and is already thinking about the next thing. He was in his early 40s. He had the look he always had in that period. Rumpled coat, unhurried on the surface, moving at a pace that suggested the internal process was running considerably faster than the external presentation. A man who looked like he was taking his time and was in fact never not working. He passed a closed door. Through it, something was happening. He didn't stop immediately. He walked 2 or 3 more steps before his feet made the decision his mind hadn't caught up to yet, and he found himself standing still in the corridor with his bag over his shoulder and his hand not quite reaching for the exit door. He stood there and he listened. What was coming through the door was not polished. It had none of the sheen that large commercial studios often imposed on whatever happened inside them. That professional smoothness that made everything sound finished even when it wasn't. What he heard was raw in the way that Waits understood rawness. Not as the absence of craft, but as craft that had gotten out of the way of something more urgent. The guitar was simple, direct, the kind of playing that makes no argument for itself and requires none. The voice on top of it was not simple at all. Waits had spent his career studying voices, not in an academic sense, not from a distance, but the way a craftsman studies materials, handling them, testing their properties, understanding what they could and couldn't bear under pressure. He knew what a voice sounded like when it was performing emotion versus when it was transmitting it. He knew the difference between a singer who had learned to communicate pain and a singer for whom communication and pain were the same unresolved act, for whom there was no gap between the feeling and the expression of it, no editorial distance, no management of the signal before it left the body. The voice coming through the door was the second kind. He recognized it the way you recognize something you felt but never quite heard externalized before. The way a particular quality of light at a specific hour can stop you on a street without your being able to explain immediately what it is you're responding to. You know it before you name it. The naming comes later, if it comes at all. He stood in the corridor for 4 minutes, maybe 5. He didn't move toward the door. He didn't knock. He didn't open it an inch to look inside. He simply stood where he was and received what was coming through the wall, the way you receive weather. Not as a choice, but as a condition. Someone who worked at the studio that day, a runner, young, whose job involved moving between rooms and managing logistics, remembered seeing Waits standing in the corridor. He said later that Waits' expression was the thing that stayed with him. Not rapt, not emotional in any visible sense, just completely still and completely focused. The way a person looks when they are listening at a depth that requires all of their available attention and leaves none over for anything else. The runner knew which session was in that room. He said nothing to Waits about it. He moved past him and went about his work. After some time, the music behind the door stopped. There was a pause. The pause between takes, the room reorganizing itself, voices exchanging brief words that didn't carry through the wall. Then it started again. Waits listened to the beginning of the second pass. Then he turned and walked out. He didn't stop at the front desk. He didn't ask whose session it was. He pushed through the exit door and went out into the Los Angeles afternoon and got into his car and drove away. He said nothing about it to anyone for a long time. Tom Waits was not someone who talked easily about other musicians. He was generous in print when asked directly, but he chose his words with the same care he chose notes, sparingly, with the understanding that silence carried meaning too, and that the most important thing about what you said was usually what you left out. He had strong opinions about music and kept most of them to himself, dispensing them occasionally in interviews that tended to become their own kind of performance, funny and oblique and difficult to quote in isolation without losing what the whole thing meant. He had also spent enough time in the music industry by 1993 to understand what public praise of another artist could become, how it got packaged, how it got used, how a genuine private observation could be extracted from its context and turned into something promotional that bore almost no relationship to the original feeling. He had no interest in contributing to that machinery. If something moved him, it moved him. That was between him and the thing. The world didn't need to be informed. He mentioned the corridor once. It was a small British newspaper, 2002 or 2003, a profile that ranged across his career with the patient thoroughness of a journalist who had done the reading. The interviewer asked him about the moment he had most recently been genuinely surprised by music. Not his own, but someone else's. Not impressed, surprised. Waits understood the distinction and appreciated it. He thought about it for long enough that the journalist noted the pause in his write-up. Then he described a corridor in a recording studio in Los Angeles. He didn't name the studio. He described standing in it. He described what he heard coming through a closed door. And he said it had stopped him in the way that very few things stopped him by that point in his career. He said the voice had a quality that he associated with people who were using music not as expression, but as survival. Not making art so much as staying alive through the act of making something, the way certain people need to keep moving or they will stop entirely. The journalist asked if he knew whose session it was. Waits looked at him. Kurt Cobain, he said. I figured it out after. Wasn't hard. The journalist asked what he had done with that information. Waits was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has something in it. Stood there, he said. Went home. Thought about it for a long time. He didn't say what he had thought. The interview moved on to other subjects. That exchange was brief enough in the original piece that it attracted almost no attention. The profile was about Waits's own work, his own process, and the Cobain section was 3 or 4 lines in a long article. The journalist who conducted the interview remembered it differently than it appeared on the page. Remembered Waits's expression when he said the name, the slight shift in register, the way the answer had a different weight than the answers before and after it. But none of that survived into print. What survived was the bare account, the corridor, the closed door, the voice. By the time the article resurfaced in online discussions years later, both men were being discussed in the past tense. Waits was still alive, still recording, still giving interviews that revealed almost nothing about his interior life. Cobain had been gone for nearly a decade. What people noticed when they found the article was the specificity of what Waits had said. Not that the music was good, not that Cobain was talented, but that what he'd heard through a closed door in a Hollywood corridor was someone using music to stay alive. That was a precise observation. It was not the language of criticism. It was the language of recognition. One practitioner identifying something in another's work that most listeners didn't have the vocabulary for. Waits had that vocabulary. He had spent his career building it. There is something in the shape of this story that resists the usual arc of influence and acknowledgement. Waits didn't seek Cobain out. He didn't arrange a meeting, didn't send a message through the industry channels that connected everyone in Los Angeles, didn't make any gesture that might have produced a conversation. He stood in a corridor, listened to something coming through a door, and left. The encounter was entirely one-sided. Cobain never knew it happened. Waits carried it privately until a journalist in Britain asked the right question at the right moment, and yet something passed between them in that corridor. Not information, not influence, something harder to name, the recognition of a quality that existed in both of them, expressed through completely different materials, but pointing at the same underlying thing. The idea that music, at its most necessary, is not a performance of feeling, but an act of survival. That the best version of it happens when the distance between the person and the sound has closed entirely, when there is no longer a safe remove from which to manage the expression. Waits had built his entire career on that idea. He had lived inside it for 20 years, made record after record that sounded like it was being produced by someone for whom the alternative to making it was genuinely unthinkable. He heard the same quality in a voice coming through a closed door in 1993. He stood still in a corridor for 5 minutes. Then he went home and thought about it for a long time. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994, less than a year after that corridor. Waits was asked about it in a subsequent interview, briefly. He gave a short answer. He said it was a loss. He didn't elaborate, but the person who had been with him when he first heard the news remembered that Waits had gone quiet in a specific way. Not the general quiet of someone receiving sad information, but the particular quiet of someone for whom the information confirmed something they had already suspected, something they had heard in a voice through a door and carried without knowing what to do with it. He had thought about it for a long time, he'd said in the British article. He never said what conclusions he had reached. Some things stay with you not because they resolve into meaning, but because they don't, because they remain open, like a door that you passed in a corridor and chose not to open. Standing in a hallway, listening to what came through, knowing that whatever was happening in that room was real in a way that you could hear from the outside, but could not enter. Tom Waits walked out when Kurt Cobain walked in. What he heard through a closed door in a Hollywood corridor in 1993 stopped him for 5 minutes and stayed with him for the rest of his life. Not as a lesson, not as an influence he could point to in any specific piece of work, but as a sound that had settled somewhere that didn't empty out, the way certain things you hear at the right moment in your life become part of the internal architecture, invisible but load-bearing. He said so once, in 3 lines, in a newspaper that almost nobody kept. Some things only need to be said once. Some recognitions only need one witness. Some corridors you walk through without opening the door and still carry the sound of what was on the other side for as long as you keep walking. He thought about it for a long time. He never said what he concluded. The voice had a quality I associate with people who are using music to stay alive, not making art, staying alive. Tom Waits, British Press interview, 2002.